In the early 1980s, the neighborhoods of South Central Los Angeles were already grappling with poverty, gang wars, and the explosive crack cocaine epidemic. Amid the chaos, another, even more chilling threat emerged. Black women, many struggling with addiction or living on the streets, began to vanish. Some were found in vacant lots, alleyways, or even dumpsters. Their lives ended in ways that left families devastated and entire communities in fear. At first, the murders seemed random, a byproduct of street violence or gang disputes that were tearing the city apart. But as the body count rose, it became clear that something more sinister was at work. By 1984, the media had dubbed the unknown perpetrator the Southside Slayer. Residents whispered about a monster lurking in the shadows, preying on women society seemed to have forgotten. For the police, it was a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. The victims, almost all black, many with histories of drug use or sex work, were rarely given headlines or urgency. But their loved ones mourned and marched, demanding justice. The killings stretched across neighborhoods infamous for gang turf wars: Compton, Watts, Florence, and Vermont. People wondered if the violence was gang-related, or if something far darker was stalking the streets. Detectives worked with what little evidence they could find, but resources were stretched thin. In a city with a homicide rate that sometimes topped 1,000 a year, cases easily went cold. Many believed that the police simply didn't care about the victims, fueling a growing sense of anger and distrust between South LA's black residents and the LAPD. What almost no one realized was that it wasn't just one killer. For years, several black serial killers operated in the same neighborhoods, sometimes even overlapping in their sprees. Among them was a mechanic named Lonnie Franklin Jr., who would later become infamous as the Grim Sleeper. There was Chester Turner, Michael Hughes, and more. Predators hiding in plain sight, feeding off the chaos and neglect of their environment. By the time police and the community began to suspect a pattern, the death toll had quietly climbed into the dozens. The streets of South Central Los Angeles weren't just plagued by gangs and drugs. A serial nightmare was unfolding, one body at a time. The early years of the Southside Slayer killings unfolded against a backdrop of chaos in South Central Los Angeles. Gangs like the Bloods and Crips were locked in bloody turf wars, and the city's homicide rate was among the nation's highest. The crack epidemic was fueling violence, desperation, and distrust, not only between rival crews but between residents and the police. For many, daily life was a struggle for survival. Gunfire was common, and abandoned buildings or alleyways were no place to linger. But for a growing number of women, the city's dangers were even more insidious. Each time a new victim was found, her body discarded in a vacant lot or alley, the fear in the community deepened. The victims had lives, families, and stories, but their disappearances were often dismissed as another consequence of the streets. Rumors swirled. Was it just one killer? Or was it a gang, sending messages through brutality? At first, police thought some of the murders might be the work of a single Southside Slayer, but, in reality, the chaos of the era actually allowed multiple serial killers to operate undetected, sometimes just blocks apart. Lonnie Franklin Jr., for instance, was a friendly neighborhood mechanic by day, quietly preying on women by night. Chester Turner was known for his violent temper, slipping in and out of homeless encampments. Michael Hughes lived only miles away and targeted many of the same types of victims. The overlapping crimes really confused investigators and made it nearly impossible to track any sort of patterns. Forensic science was limited back then, and evidence was often scarce or even tainted by the open environments where the bodies were found. To make things even more complicated, police trust in the neighborhood was at an all-time low. People were, understandably, reluctant to cooperate, fearing retaliation not only from gangs but from the killers themselves. Still, whispers of the Southside Slayer just wouldn't go away. Some folks called the violence a curse. Others believed there was more than one predator stalking the streets. But with the city's attention locked on gang wars and the crack epidemic, the pleas of grieving families were sadly largely ignored. It would take years, community activism, and eventually breakthroughs in forensic technology before the truth about the Southside Slayer era and the men behind the violence would finally come to light. As the years dragged on, the nightmare in South Los Angeles grew more complex and terrifying. The Southside Slayer wasn't a single shadowy figure but a series of predators hiding in plain sight, each operating independently, yet feeding off the same chaos and neglect. Lonnie Franklin Jr., later called the Grim Sleeper, lived on a quiet residential street fixing cars for neighbors and joking with kids. By night, he cruised the city, picking up vulnerable women, promising rides or help, only to attack them in secluded alleys and abandoned lots. He photographed many of his victims, keeping a twisted record of his crimes. He would eventually be linked to at least 10 murders between 1985 and 2007, but police believe the true count could be far higher. Chester Turner, another serial predator, haunted the same neighborhoods during the 1980s and 90s. He drifted between low-rent motels, homeless encampments, and the streets, preying mostly on women with nowhere to go. When finally caught years later, Turner was connected through DNA to at least 14 murders, making him one of Los Angeles's most prolific killers. Michael Hughes, yet another, targeted women in similar circumstances, often those who were unhoused or struggling with addiction. His crimes overlapped with both Turner and Franklin, making it almost impossible for detectives to untangle the web of cases. At the time, the community could only guess at the scale of what was happening. The press occasionally ran stories about the mounting number of murdered black women, but the cases rarely made headlines outside South LA. Residents saw patterns where police saw chaos. Grieving families put up flyers and held vigils, but their cries for justice often fell on deaf ears. For the women of South Central, the danger felt constant and close. They wondered, was it the gangs, the drugs, or was there something much worse lurking in the night? The killers themselves seemed invisible, blending into the backdrop of a city in crisis. For years the murders went unsolved, the truth lost in the noise, until pressure from the community, new DNA technology, and a few determined investigators set the stage for a breakthrough that would shock Los Angeles and finally bring some of the city's most prolific serial predators into the light. By the late 1990s, frustration and outrage had reached a breaking point in South Los Angeles. Families of the victims, tired of being ignored, formed support groups and staged protests demanding answers from law enforcement. Activists like Margaret Prescott and organizations such as the Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders shined a spotlight on the alarming number of murdered black women, forcing local media and the LAPD to acknowledge a crisis that could no longer be explained away by gang violence alone. Amid mounting pressure, detectives began to revisit old case files looking for patterns missed in the chaos of the previous decade. The introduction of new forensic technologies, particularly DNA analysis, offered hope. In 2001, the LAPD formed a special task force to address the backlog of unsolved murders. For the first time, detectives started linking killings that had once seemed unrelated. In 2008, the breakthrough finally came. DNA from a cold case matched Lonnie Franklin Jr., who had eluded suspicion for decades by living a quiet life among his neighbors. He was dubbed the Grim Sleeper because of a perceived 14-year gap in his killings, a pause that would later be challenged as more victims were identified. Police searched Franklin's home and discovered, hundreds of photographs of unidentified women, further evidence of his years-long reign of terror. Meanwhile, similar advances in DNA technology tied Chester Turner and Michael Hughes to a string of unsolved murders. Turner, already serving time for unrelated crimes, was ultimately linked to the deaths of at least 14 women. Hughes, too, was convicted after DNA tied him to a series of slayings that had haunted South Central for years. With the killers unmasked, the city was finally forced to reckon with the magnitude of what had happened. The truth was staggering. While Los Angeles had focused on gang wars and drugs, multiple serial killers had stalked the same neighborhoods, preying on the most vulnerable and overlooked. The arrests brought some measure of relief, but for many families the answers came too late. Decades had passed and countless questions lingered, about missed opportunities, systemic failures, and the lives that might have been saved if the victims' stories had mattered sooner. The arrest of Lonnie Franklin Jr., Chester Turner, and Michael Hughes marked the beginning of long-awaited justice. But the scars left on South Central Los Angeles ran deep. As the cases moved through the courts, families of victims filled the courtrooms, determined to see the faces of the men who had terrorized their community for years. The trials were emotional and often overwhelming. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence including DNA matches and photographs recovered from Franklin's home. Survivors and family members took the stand, describing years of grief, frustration, and fear. For some, the testimony brought a measure of closure. For others, it only deepened the pain, knowing so many questions would remain unanswered. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the so-called Grim Sleeper, was convicted in 2016 of 10 murders and sentenced to death. Though, honestly, many believe his true number of victims will never be known. Chester Turner was found guilty of at least 14 murders and Michael Hughes of multiple slayings. Their convictions exposed a staggering reality. For decades, the streets of South LA had been haunted not by one, but by several serial killers operating at the same time, their crimes hidden in the shadows of larger citywide crises. The trials also laid bare the failures of the justice system. Activists, community leaders, and journalists questioned why it had taken so long for the police and public to take the murders seriously. The neglect of black women, the lack of media attention, and the slow response from authorities were all brought into sharp focus. As one family member put it, "They just didn't care until we made them." Even with convictions, the sense of loss endured. The families of victims, though grateful for justice, mourned the years stolen from them, and the loved ones taken far too soon. For South Central Los Angeles, the end of the trials was a moment of reckoning, an opportunity to remember those lost, confront hard truths, and, demand that their stories never be forgotten again. The Southside Slayer era left South Central Los Angeles forever changed. The convictions of Franklin, Turner, and Hughes brought long-awaited accountability, but the aftermath revealed wounds that would take years to heal. The city was forced to reckon not only with the horror of the murders but also with the decades of neglect and silence that had allowed so many women to become victims. For the families, there was a bittersweet sense of justice. Many felt relief that the killers could no longer hurt anyone, but there was, honestly, lingering anger at how their loved ones' lives had been overlooked. Community activists pushed for reforms, demanding that the police treat every missing person, regardless of race, gender, or background, with urgency and respect. The legacy of the murdered women became a rallying cry for those determined to break the cycle of indifference. The impact of these crimes rippled beyond the courts and neighborhoods. Journalists, filmmakers, and artists began telling the stories that had been ignored for too long, giving voice to families who refused to let their daughters, sisters, and mothers be forgotten. The city implemented changes in how it handled missing persons and cold cases, hoping to prevent history from repeating itself. But the scars remain. For years, residents of South Central lived with a quiet fear, knowing that their stories and safety were often an afterthought. The era of the Southside Slayer became a dark chapter in Los Angeles history, a lesson in what happens when communities are left unheard and justice delayed. Today, the names of the women lost are spoken with pride and remembrance. Their legacy is a call to vigilance and compassion, a reminder that every life matters and that no one should ever be invisible. The fight for justice continues, fueled by those who refuse to let these stories fade into silence.